How in the world does a group of colonial rebels manage to take on the mightiest military empire on the planet and actually win? It really is one of history's greatest underdog stories. Okay, let's dive right in and unpack how the American colonists pulled off the impossible.
I mean, you just look at this on paper and it's a total mismatch, right? On one side, you've got the British Empire, a global superpower. We're talking 8 million people, the strongest navy in the entire world, and a professional, well-trained army. And on the other side, the American patriots. Their population is just 2.5 million. They've got no regular army to speak of, a navy that's, well, barely a navy, and their fighters are mostly colonial militias.
So, you gotta ask, how on earth did this happen? How did David beat Goliath? Well, the answer isn't just one single thing. It's really a combination of powerful ideas, clever strategy, and, yeah, a little help from some very important friends.
You know, before this was a war for independence, it was really a fight over rights. This didn't just happen overnight. The whole conflict was years in the making, as people who saw themselves as loyal British subjects slowly but surely turned into revolutionaries. What's so wild is just how fast this all escalated. We're talking about a single decade. It all kicked off with Parliament trying to pay off its war debts. But just look at this domino effect. A tax on sugar in '64, then a direct tax on all paper goods in '65. Every move the British made just sparked a bigger, more organized protest from the colonists. It wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow burn that went from protests to street violence like the Boston Massacre, and then finally to open rebellion after those punishing, intolerable acts. And this was the phrase that lit the fuse. It became the rallying cry for groups like the Sons of Liberty. See, the colonists weren't just mad about paying taxes. They were absolutely furious that these laws were being forced on them by a parliament thousands of miles away where they didn't have a single person representing them. To them, this wasn't just unfair, it was a violation of their basic rights as Englishmen.
And man, this is a perfect example of how they got the word out. This is Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre. It's a masterful piece of propaganda, showing British soldiers just opening fire on a helpless, peaceful crowd. Now, it wasn't exactly what happened, but it was incredibly powerful. Images like this, plus all these fiery essays and pamphlets and newspapers, this flow of information became the lifeblood of the revolution. It's how you get 13 very different colonies to start thinking and acting like one.
And then came this, the Declaration of Independence. And with these words, the whole game changed. It wasn't a protest anymore. It wasn't about getting their rights as British subjects. This was now a war to create an entirely new kind of nation, one founded on the radical idea that people had the right to rule themselves.
But look, having a powerful cause doesn't automatically mean you're going to win. In fact, the first few years of the war were an absolute disaster for the Americans. They were almost always on the run, and they were pushed right to the edge of total defeat.
And if you want to see just how bad things got, you have to look at Valley Forge. That winter of '77, Washington's army was literally starving and freezing to death. They had little food, not enough clothing, and disease was everywhere. Soldiers were just giving up and walking away. The whole revolution was this close to collapsing. But then, Saratoga. This was the game changer. Against all odds, the Continental Army managed to surround and force the surrender of an entire British army. This victory was huge, not just on the battlefield, but in the world of politics. It was the proof that everyone, especially in Europe, needed to see. It showed that these American rebels were for real.
And that victory was all the proof France needed. They saw a golden opportunity to get some revenge on their old rival, Great Britain. So they officially recognized the United States and jumped into the war on the American side. This one move changed absolutely everything.
Because with France came money, a navy, and, just as important, military expertise. You had guys like the Marquis de Lafayette from France, who became one of Washington's most important leaders. And then there was Baron von Steuben, a Prussian drill master who showed up at Valley Forge and, through sheer force of will, turned those starving, ragtag rebels into a disciplined army that could stand toe-to-toe with the British.
So now you've got it all. A powerful cause, a powerful ally, and a newly trained army. The Patriots were finally able to go on the attack, and they started using their home field advantage with some very unconventional tactics that drove the British absolutely crazy.
They leaned hard into this thing called guerrilla warfare. You know, this wasn't the kind of fighting the British were used to, where armies line up in a field. No, this was all about small, quick-moving groups using their knowledge of the local terrain to ambush British supply lines and patrols and then just melt back into the woods.
And the absolute master of this was a guy down in South Carolina named Francis Marion, aka the Swamp Fox. He and his men were a nightmare for the British. They'd strike fast and then disappear into the swamps where nobody could follow. This kind of fighting didn't just win small battles. It wore the British down, made them constantly afraid, and it made it impossible for them to ever feel like they were actually in control.
All of this leads to the final checkmate at Yorktown, and it was just a perfectly executed trap. First, the British General Cornwallis makes a huge mistake. He pulls his army onto the Yorktown Peninsula to wait for the British Navy. That's when Lafayette moves in and pins him down by land. But the key move? The French Navy shows up and beats the British fleet, blocking the only escape route by sea. And the final piece of the puzzle, Washington's main army marches down and seals the trap, surrounding 8,000 British soldiers.
Cornwallis was trapped. He had no choice but to surrender. And you can just imagine the scene. As the British soldiers lay down their arms, their own military band supposedly played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." You really couldn't have picked a better song for a moment that changed history forever.
Okay, so let's put it all together. How did they actually do it? It wasn't just one thing. It was this powerful formula, this perfect storm of factors that led to this unbelievable victory. First off, you can't overstate the home field advantage. The Patriots knew the land, which was perfect for their hit-and-run style. Then you add in the foreign help from France and Spain, which was absolutely critical. I mean, without the French Navy at Yorktown, who knows what would have happened? This support allowed Washington to fight a war of attrition. He knew he didn't have to win every single battle. He just had to keep his army from being destroyed and drag the war out until it got too expensive and too unpopular for the British to keep fighting. But maybe the most powerful weapon they had was their cause. They were fighting for liberty, for this new idea of a nation. That's a motivation that a soldier fighting thousands of miles from home just can't match. And you have to remember what was on the line for these guys. Benjamin Franklin put it perfectly when they were signing the Declaration. This was treason. They were literally risking everything. It was either win and create a new country or lose and be hanged. That kind of shared risk creates an unbreakable bond.
So they had done the impossible. They'd won their independence against the greatest superpower on Earth. But in a lot of ways, winning the war was the easy part. The real question was, now what? Could these 13 states, which had just barely managed to unite for a war, actually come together and build a single, lasting nation?